in the thing. All right. Wait, what the fuck? Oh, it's not here. 22 September military convention in Cleveland, September 8th by Friends Johnson. Okay, I'm gonna read that Governor Burwow, Tennessee, on discussing. It's just to reset it, just a bit. Yeah, I think it's a good idea, at least in my brain. No. Uh, well, this is nice and calm. Duly reposted. Look at that, and shared. Go go! Such a huge, such a huge build up to like barely any beat. That's funny. Oh, ding, ding, ding. Sonic music, yeah, right. Video game music. All right, let's get started, everybody. Let's get started. Let's just see what they say here. We're talking about black suffrage and stuff like that in the conventions and stuff. So Governor Brownlow of Tennessee, in discussing black suffrage at this same convention on September 3rd, 1866, said, "Some gentlemen, from the mistaken view of my character, said they are afraid of black suffrage and wanted to dodge it. I have never dodged any subject, nor have I ever been found on both sides of any subject. While I am satisfied with everything done here, I would go further. I am an advocate for black suffrage and imperial suffrage. Oh, impartial suffrage. Yeah, not imperial, impartial. I would rather associate with loyal black people than with disloyal white men. I would rather be buried in a black graveyard than a rebel graveyard. And after death, I would sooner go to a black heaven than a white rebel hell," which is still racist. He's still giving the contrast that like, yeah, the following. Yeah, I remember that. The following, and there followed a September, and in September, two military conventions. One in Cleveland, September 18th, by Friends of Johnson, which did not mention black suffrage. It denounced the abolitionists and said that they were trying to force another war. It contained many Democrats and a few conservative Republicans. Confederate officers at Mississippi included General Forrest of Fort Pillow. Fame sent sympathy by telegram, which was unfortunate publicity. Yeah, in the answer of this to this, a national convention of, quote, citizens, soldiers, and sailors was held in Pittsburgh, September 25th to the 26th. There were many volunteer officers of high rank, and Johnson was denounced, and the 14th Amendment advocate. Oh, Johnson was denounced. Yeah, and Johnson was denounced, and the 14th Amendment advocated. This convention had great influence on the public opinion and popularized the 14th Amendment. The issue in the election of the fall of 1866 turned on whether Congress should recognize Southern states as reconstructed by Johnson. It was not a presidential year, but a congressman and state legislators were to be elected. The real campaign began in August with the 14th of August convention in Philadelphia. This convention greatly encouraged Johnson, and he wrote it attacking Congress for preventing the restoration of peace and union and denying that it was really a legal Congress. Quote, if I had wanted authority or if I had wished to perpetuate my own power, how easily could I have held and wielded that which was placed in my hands by the measure called Freemen's Bureau Bill. On July 4th, he had issued another proclamation of general amnesty. And on August 20th, he declared that the Civil War at an end. Already in the spring, he had promised to lay the cornerstone and a monument of Stephen and a Douglas in Chicago, and he left Washington August 28th on the great campaign tour, which was to sweep the country. He took General Grant with him and members of his cabinet, and Seward joined him in New York. Johnson stopped at Philadelphia, New York, Albany, and then went west by way of Cleveland, Chicago, and St. Louis. It was an extraordinary and increasingly painful effort by which Johnson definitely defeated himself and his own political policies. He showed genius for saying the wrong thing. In New York, for instance, he asked, quote, are we prepared after the cost of war to continue to disrupt conditions of the country? Why are we afraid of the representatives of the South? Some have grown fat. Some have grown rich by the aggression and destruction of others. In Philadelphia, he declared that God was a tailor like himself. At Cleveland, his audience became a mob while the president himself increased the hubbub. The city authorities had made preparations for a polite reception, but as he proceeded with his harangue, and the mob took complete possession of the crowd. Someone cried, why not hang Thad Stevenson and Wendell Phillips? Yes, yelled Johnson, why not hang them? Some towns hung out black flags and banners. No welcome to traitors. Bands played the death march. Johnson shouted in defiance. His egotism was ridiculed. He was charged with being drunk, a traitor, and a demigod. On he reeled, as Burgess said, quote, the trip degraded the presidential office. The New York Tribune watched it with a, quote, feeling of national shame and called it, quote, the stumbling tour of the unbraided demagogue. The New York World excused him by asking who of all presidents had been lower than Lincoln in personal bearing. The Herald put the blame on Seward's shoulders. I'm gonna look up this word. Let's look up a word, everybody. Yay! Just kidding. MEPHIST. OPH. There it is. Oh, it's a what? Huh. It looks like a magical character. It's a demon originating from German folklore that's known as the devil or chief agents of evil who make a pact with Faust. I don't know how to say this. Mephisto. I was trying to see if I can pronounce it, but thank you. Appreciate it. What did you say it was? Yeah. All right. Of the administration. Lowell called the journey, quote, an indecent orgy. Rhodes says he was intoxicated at Cleveland, while Schuyler declared he was sober. The culmination came in St. Louis, where Johnson declared that the blood of the New Orleans riots was on Congress and decried the diabolical and nefarious policies of Stephen, Phillips, and Sumner. The most charitable thing that the defenders of Andrew Johnson can say of him is that occasionally he got drunk. For too much liquor alone would excuse such extraordinary conduct and performance in his vice presidential inauguration. His speech of February 22nd, 1866, he exhibited his exposition at Cleveland and his St. Louis debauch. He was, if he was not an occasionally drunkard, he was God's own fool. He returned to Washington, as Schultz says, an utterly discomfited and disgraced man, having gone out to win popular support and having earned only public disgust. The role of Seward during this episode was pathetic. One of the wits of the time spoke of Seward's new office of bear leader. Unfortunately, he was very unsuccessful, even in this task, for he could do little more than apologize for Johnson, and in a few commonplace sentences, called upon the audience to support the president in opposition to Congress. At Niagara, he told the crowd that Lincoln had been traduced when alive. What's that mean? Uh, Traduced is to speak maliciously, falsely, and unfavorably about someone to damage their reputation. Traduced, when alive, but after his assassination, all hearts inclined to the deepest sorrow, and it would be a shame if Johnson should be taken off. To the citizens of Buffalo, he stated the issue as followed: the question is between the president and the Congress. Of all that has been done to bring us so near the consummation of Reconstruction, you see that nothing has been done that has not done through the direction, agency, activity, perseverance, and patriotism of Andrew Johnson, President of the United States. Will you stand by Congress or will you stand by the president? The Republicans took every advantage of the situation. They saw in Johnson the instinct of the poor white cropping out. He could not shake off the bootlicking proclivity born and bred in him towards the aristocracy of the South. Miserable fool. Stevens made but one speech in the campaign of 1866. He said that he had been directed by his physicians neither to think, speak, nor read until the next session of Congress, that he had followed the orders not to read almost literally. It is true, I have amused myself with little light, frivolous reading. For instance, there was a serial account from day to day of a very remarkable circus that traveled through the country from Washington to Chicago and St. Louis, and from Louisville back to Washington. I read that with some interest, expecting to see in so celebrated an establishment, which from its heralding was to beat Dean Rice and all the old circuses that ever went forth. I expect great wit from the celebrated character of its clowns. As the campaign of 1866 progressed, the agitation in favor of granting suffrage to black people was a necessary protection of his freedom became marked. First of all, industry and trade were convinced that they could not trust the white South. Therefore, the more extreme ideas which Stevens had advocated were allowed to be broadcast. Their logic was strong and their methods popular. People had faith in laws and wanted some great enactment in keeping with the greatness of the war. It was a ripe time for amending the Constitution and inaugurating final reforms. These reforms might be an advance at the time, but they were worth trying, and there appeared to be no middle path. Thus, as the campaign went on, black suffrage occupied a more and more important position. Stevens, Wade, Sumner, Chase, Scrooge, and Chandler were in favor of it. To many Northerners, it had been at first unthinkable, but more and more they became convinced. The nation urged full black suffrage and black civil rights, but opposed the exclusion of white leaders from office. Quote, the doctrine that, inside the quote, with it, the doctrine that this is a white man's government and intended for white men only, is as a Perry's profess it, as monstrous a doctrine as was ever concocted. To allow states to recognize on the basis of nation of the basis the nation added will make a very name of American democracy and hissing and a byword among the nations of the earth. To have this theory of the nature of our government boldly thrust in our faces now, after the events of the last 4 years, by men who have come red-handed from the battlefield and to whose garments the blood of our brothers and sons still clings. And to know that the president, who owes in part at least his ability to be president to the valor of blood and people of color troops, concurs with them in this scandalous repudiation of democratic principles, are things which the country we trust will find it hard to bear. For a brief period, for a seven mystic years that stretched between Johnson, quote, swinging around the circle, to the panic of 1873, the majority of thinking Americans on the North believed in the equal manhood of black people. They acted according with the thoroughness of clean-cut decisions that no age which does not share that faith can in the slightest comprehend. They did not free draft animals, nor enfranchise guerrillas, nor welcome morons to Congress. They simply recognized black folks as men. Quote, the South called for war, said James Russell Lowell, and we have given it to her. We will fix the terms of peace ourselves, and we will teach the South that Christ is disgusted in a dusky race. Disguised. I said disguised. I said this. Okay. They came in the 1973 to 76, sudden and complete disillusion. Not a black person, but at the world, at business, at work, at religion, at art. A bitter protest of Southern property and reinforced Northern reaction. And while after long years the American world recovered in most manners, it was never quite understood why it could never have thought that black men were altogether human. There were men in the South and former slaveholders who knew the truth and spoke it. They knew that there could be no salvation for the South in time or eternity until the former slave went forth as a man. But the entrenched intolerance of the South, coupled with the awful grief at the death of the flower of Southern manhood, let such prophets speak but few words. They spoke here and there in nearly every Southern state, but they very soon threatened into silence. And there prevailed a bitter hatred and cry for vengeance for people who could not brook defeat because they had been used to victory and had the slave-born habits of arrogance. For their grief, none had greater sympathy than the bulk of their former slaves. They served and even succored their former master. And yet upon these and their fellows was eventually placed the whole wrath of the South, which in could not turn towards the North. And especially it fell upon those freemen who felt their freedom, who were uplifted by new ambition, who showed the gathered resentment of 200 years of whipping, kicking, and cuffing and cuffs. In fine, on them who had rolling in their ears God's great quote, dispossute potentis. I think this is I don't know what this is, but we're going to read it. He hath put down the mighty for their seats. He hath exalted them of low degree. After the final election in 1866, the Republicans had 143 members in the House, and the Democrats had 49. All states gave strong majorities to the Republican Party, except the border states of Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. In the South, Democratic candidates were universally successful. Not counting the South, the Republicans in the Senate had a 2/3 majority, nearly a 3/4 majority in the House. Through the winter of 1866 to 1867, notwithstanding the result of the election of 1866, the South rejected the 14th Amendment. Virginia gave 1 vote in favor. North Carolina, 11 out of 148. South Carolina, 1 vote. Georgia, 2 out of 169. Alabama, 10 out of 106. Texas, 5. And Arkansas, 3. Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana were unanimously against it. Thus, the South defied Congress and demanded that the disenfranchised black person should be counted as basis of representation. The South was encouraged in this stand by the president. The governor of Alabama telegraphed him that the rejection of the 14th Amendment could be reconsidered by his state, but Johnson discouraged him. This increased the strength of the Republicans in the North. The president's message of December 4th, 1866, with all the earmarks of Seward, was calm and skillful. He said that the war was ended and that the nation could now proceed as a free, prosperous United Nations. He had already informed Congress of his efforts for the gradual restoration of the states, that all that remained now was the admission to Congress of loyal senators and representatives. While Congress had been considering this, the president had appointed various public officials, and the 13th Amendment had been passed. Yet Congress hesitated to admit the southern states to representation, and after 8 months, only Tennessee had been admitted. We wish to leave the whole matter of suffrage of the states, and he has significantly silent on the black codes. The second session of the 39th Congress began December 3rd. The Senate asked for a report on the condition of the southern states, since the president had said practically nothing about it. The president replied December 19th, 1866, as a result of the measures instituted by the executive with the view of inducing a reassumption of the functions of the states apprehended in the inquiry of the state, the people of North Carolina, South Carolina, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee have recognized their respective state governments and are yielding obedience to the laws and government of the United States with more willingness and greater promptitude than under the circumstances could reasonably have been anticipated. The proposed amendment to the Constitution, providing for the abolition of slavery forever within the limits of the country, has been ratified by each one of those states, with the exception of Mississippi, from which no official information has yet been received. And in nearly all of them, measures, and nearly all of them measures have been adopted or are now pending, to confer upon freedmen rights and privileges which are essential to their comfort, protection, and security. In Florida and Texas, the people are making commendable progress in restoring their state governments, and no doubt it is entertained that they will at an earlier period be in the condition to resume all of their practical relations to the federal government. It is true that in some of the states, the demoralizing effects of the earth are to be seen in occasional disorder, but these are local in the character of frequent and occurrence, and are rapidly disappearing as the authority of the civil law is extended and sustained. Perplexing questions were naturally to be expected from the great and sudden change of the relations between the two races, but systems are gradually developing themselves under which the freeman will receive the protection to which he is justly entitled, and by means of his labor make himself a useful and independent member of the community in which he has his home. The transubstantiation of Andrew Johnson was complete. He had begun as the champion of poor laborer, demanding that the land monopoly of Southern oligarchy be broken up, so as to give access to the soil, South and West, to be free laborer. He had demanded the punishment of those Southerners who, by slavery and war, had made such an economic program impossible. Suddenly thrust into the presidency, he had retreated from this attitude. He had not only given up extravagant ideas of punishment, but he dropped his demand for dividing up plantations when he realized that black people would largely be beneficiaries, because he could not conceive of black people as men. He refused to advocate universal democracy, of which in his young manhood he had been the fiercest advocate, and made strong alliances with those who would restore slavery under another name. This change did not come by deliberate thought or cautious desire to hurt. It was rather a tragedy of American prejudice made flesh, so that the man born to narrow circumstances, a rebel against economic privilege, died with the conventional ambition of a poor white to be the associate and benefactor of monopolistic planters and slave drivers. In some respect, Andrew Johnson is a most painful figure in American history. A man who, pitiful. A man who, despite great powers and great ideas, became a puppet played upon by mighty fingers and selfish, subtle minds, groping, self-made, unlettered, and alone, drunk, not so much with liquor as with the heady wine of sudden and incidental success. My wild soul waited on the falcon's hover. I beat the ready fin as I trampled past. I heard the morning loon in the marsh beneath the moon, and then, with feathery thunder, the bird of my desire broke from the cover, flashing silver fire, hanging high up among the stars. I saw his pinion spire. The pale cloud gazed aghast as my falcon dropped upon him. It gripped and held him fast. And that's the end of that chapter. Chapter 8. No, yes. Chapter 8. Hello. 9. The Price of Disaster is the next chapter. I wonder what this is going to be about. The Price of Disaster. I wonder what we're going to talk about now. Let's find out. Oh, hold on. I gotta do this. Hold on. 1, 2, 3. And then one there. And then, come on. There we go. And then 1, 2, 3. No, one more. There we go. All right, that's all I got. The price of disaster of slavery and civil war was a necessity of quickly assimilating into American democracy as mass of ignorant laborers, in whom hands alone for the moment lay the power of preserving the ideals of popular government, of overthrowing a slave economy and establishing upon it an industry primarily for the profit of the workers. It was this price which, in the end, America refused to pay, and today suffers for that refusal. The year 1867 comes. The election of 1866 has sent to the 40th Congress a Republican majority of 42 to 11 against 11 in the Senate, and 143 against 49 in the House. The decisive battle for Reconstruction looms. Abolition democracy demands for Black physical freedom, civil rights, economic opportunity and education, and the right to vote as a matter of sheer human justice and right. Industry demand profit and is willing to use for this end Black freedom and Black slavery. Votes for Black people or Black codes. The South beaten in war, the socially and economically disorganized, was knocking at the doors of the Congress with increased political power and with the determination to restore land monopoly and to reorganize its agrarian industry and to attempt to restore its capital by reducing public taxation to the lowest point. Moreover, it had not given up the idea that the capital, which it had lost through the legal abolition of slavery, should and might be reimbursed from the federal treasury. Especially it was determined to use for its own end the increased political power based on voteless Black people. Finally, there was the West, beginning to fear the grip of land and transportation monopoly, rebelling against the power of Eastern industry, and staggering under the weight of public debt and public taxation. In the midst of these elements stood Andrew Johnson, with the tremendous power which lay in his hands as commander-in-chief of the army, with the large patron which arose through the expansion of governmental functions during the war, and with a stubborn will and a resourceful, astute Secretary of State. Logically, Andrew Johnson was, as an early leader of land reform and of democracy in industry for the peasant farmer and the laboring class, was in a position to lead the democracy of the West. But perversely, he had been induced by flattery, by his Southern birth, and his dislike of New England Puritanism, to place himself at the head of the Southerners between the program of the South and that of the West. Then there was absolutely no point of alliance. The South represented the extreme and reactionary capitalism based upon land and on the ownership of labor. It showed no signs of any more sympathy with the labor movement in the North or the extension of democratic methods that it had before the war. There was not a single labor voice raised in the Southern post-war clamor. Yet Johnson could not see this. He continued to flirt with Western liberalism at the very time he was surrendering completely to the Southern reaction and ultra-conservatism. In his advice to the South, be no longer contemplated Black suffrage in any form, and he said nothing of poor whites. In 1867, Black votes were refused in the municipal election in Virginia. Judge Moore asked President Johnson concerning the right of freemen to participate in these elections, but Johnson gave no answer. On the other hand, in an interview with Charles Halpin, March 5th, he sought again to make alliance with the Western unrest. He said, To the people, the national debt is a thing of debt to be paid, but to the aristocracy of bonds and national securities, it is a property of more than 2.5 million. Wait. Oh, 2.5 billion. Yeah. From which the revenue of 180 billion. Wait. Yeah, 180 million. That's right. 180 million a year to be received into their pocket. So now we find that the aristocracy of the South, based on, make sure, 3 billion in black people. Yeah, that's 100. Yeah, who were the productive class has disappeared, and their place in political control of the country is assumed by the aristocracy based on nearly 3 billion of national debt, a thing which is not producing anything, but which goes on steadily every year and must go on for all time until the debt is paid, absorbing the taxing at the rate of 6 or 7% a year for every $100 bond that is represented in its aggregation. There you go. The war of finance is the next war we have to fight, and every blow struck against my efforts to uphold the strict construction of the laws and the Constitution is in reality a blow in favor of repudiation and the national debt. Repudiating the national debt. The manufacturers and men of capital in eastern states and the states along the Atlantic seaboard are mere strip of fringed on the broad mantle of our country. If you will examine the map, these are the favor of high protective and, in fact, prohibitory tariffs, and also favor of contraction and of the currency. But against both measures, the interests and votes of the great producing and non-manufacturing states of the West had irrevocably arrayed, and a glance at the map and the census static of the last 20 years will tell everyone who is open to conviction how that war must end. This was a melodrama argument. What's melodrama? You know? I'm going to. Maladroit. Someone or something that is clumsy, unskilled, or socially tactless, often bungling situations, movement, or social interactions. Okay. It's placed of the national debt against the loss of slave property as equally sinister phenomenon. It suggests partial repudiation and thus frightened and antagonized investors. It rightly protested against the extravagance of wartime finance, but this protest came from a man who was not now the acknowledged leader of property and reaction in the South. What basis of alliance could there be between those determined to control and exploit freed labor in the South and those who wished to fight exploitation and monopoly in the West? Moreover, in his effort to conciliate the lead of West Johnson, attacked the most powerful enemy before him. The enemy was not abolition democracy, as he falsely conceived. It was a tremendous new and rising power of organized wealth and capitalist industry in the North. Monopoly profits from investments were increasing and destined to increase, and their increase depended upon a high protective tariff and validity of the public debt The control of the national banks and currency, all of these things were threatened by the South and by Andrew Johnson as leader of the South. On the other hand, humanitarian radicalism, as far as black people was concerned, was not only completely harnessed to capital and property in the North, but its programs for votes for black people more and more became manifestly and only protection upon which Northern industry could depend. The abolitionists were not enemies of capital. The American abolitionists were typical bourgeois Democrats, revolutionists under specific American conditions. They felt their movement linked up with the great humanitarian cause of the day, the laboring question and peace question, the emancipation of women, temperance, philanthropy, and with the bourgeois revolutionary movement in Europe. He hailed the revolution in 1848 in France. Moorfield's story tells of Sumner, the similar outbreak of their country as part of the great movement for freedom, in which the anti-slavery agitation in America was another part. But the former abolitionists were gradually developing under the leadership of Stevens and Sumner. They were beginning to realize the economic foundation of the revolutionary necessary in the South. They saw that black people needed land and education, that his vote would only be valuable to him as it opened the doors to a firm economic foundation and real intelligence. If now they could get the industrial North not simply to give black people the votes, but to give him land and give him schools, the battle would be won. Here, however, they were only partially successful. Stevens could not get them to listen to his plan of land distribution, and Sumner failed in his efforts to provide for a national system of black schools. But they could and did get the aid of industry, commerce, and labor for black suffrage. And this vast step forward they gladly took. Public opinion upon philanthropy, but it was guided by big businesses. In the meantime, the nation was in the midst of a transition period. Nothing could be settled until the fate of the 14th Amendment was known. And during this time of waiting, from July 16, 1966 until July 20th, 1868, the status of the North and relations to the Union was unsettled. Slowly, the nation voted for the 14th Amendment, destined to curb the political power of the South. Most of New England and two Western states ratified it in the summer of and fall of 1866. Before January 7, southern states rejected it almost unanimously. And in the first 3 months of 1867, the whole South and the border states had pronounced against it. They said, in effect, no black citizens nor voters, no guarantee, I can't say the damn word, of civil rights to black people, and all political power based on the counting of the full black population. The North by 1868 had ratified the 14th Amendment unanimously, although New Jersey, Ohio, and Oregon made attempts to reverse their decision when Democrats gained power in those states. There was not only the vast final problem of economics and government, there was an immediate transition problem. In the interval during which the nation was awaiting the fate of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, that was to be the status of the South. The South was in the midst of industrial, civil, and political anarchy, crime, force, and murder, disorganized and wandering laborers, unorganized industry were widely in evidence. The United States was a sovereign nation, could declare the southern states there where rebellion had occurred, unorganized territory, and could rule them by civil government backed by federal police. But those who regarded the Constitution as a fetched, this might be pronounced sacrilege, but to ordinary human beings, it was by far the best and sanest thing that the nation could have done, and it would have saved the United States and the whole world untold injury, retrogression, and world war. This was the plan of both Stevens and Sumner's. The constitutional lawyers have pronounced it reasonable. With some reluctance, the nation refused to do this while the South and its friends howled in opposition. It was one would have thought an unhallowed attempt to rock the foundation of the universe and overthrow the kingdom of the Almighty God. The refusal of the nation was chiefly because the new industry, the money-making financiers, and the organizers of the vast economic empire hesitated at the government's guardianship of labor and control of industry on the scale that might embarrass future freedom of exploitation, and certainly would increase present taxation. Many advocates of abolition democracy were also doubtful. They were still under the freedom cry of the 18th century and obsessed by the American assumption of the 19th. They were still, on the whole, afraid of the full logic of democracy and the ability of the state to secure servants as honest and efficient as private industry. Only their most courageous leaders dared all. The easiest way out, then, was to prolong the military rule already established as a necessity of the war. This was cheapest and easiest, but also it was of necessity temporary. It must be a step towards civil rule, and it must inaugurate civil rule. The law of March 2nd, 1867 was enacted. It provided for black suffrage. What else could it have provided for? If it had confined the vote to whites, not only would the anti-black legislation be confirmed, but the gift of additional political power to the South to be used against Northern industry and against democracy would be outright and irrevocable. Johnson vetoed the bill, and when it was passed over, his veto had recourse to executive action, which would nullify it. Eventually, it was this that led to the attempt to impeach him. Let us now more in detail study the facts of this development. The second session of the 39th Congress assembled in December 1866 with a distinct mandate for the people. This mandate called for the reorganization of the Southern states on the basis of the 14th Amendment, and for the definitiveness of this mandate, the South had only itself and Andrew Johnson to blame. From 1864 to 1868, by the succession of elections, which wide publicity on both sides and usually full discussion, national public opinion had come to these discussions by a large majority. 1. The emancipated slave must be protected because he had helped save the Union, which slavery had disrupted. 2. The first protection for the slave was a legal status of freedom. This the South opposed in the 15 former slave states, including the border states. 4 flatly refused to accept the 13th Amendment. 3 others accepted, but only on conditions that freedom should not imply full civil and political rights. 8 states accepted the 13th Amendment, but 5 of these, and the 3 which accepted on conditions, acted upon under pressure from Johnson, and their action expressed the opinion of the minority of the former voting population. And for this reason, these states feared to refer their action to popular approval. Number 3, the legal status of freedom without actual civil rights would mean almost nothing. The answer of the South to a proposal of civil rights was the Black Codes, which established a new status of slavery with a modified slave trade. 4. The Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill represented an attempt at federal intervention to enforce freedom by federal law. The South bitterly opposed these attempts on the part of the national government and declared with Johnson that such attempts were unconstitutional. 5. To set this point at rest, the 14th Amendment was proposed, which made Black citizens, guaranteed them civil rights by national law and political rights if they were counted as the basis of representation in Congress. The South promptly rejected this overture unanimously, except in Tennessee. And there, the majority of white voters had to be disenfranchised before the acceptance was carried through. But behind all this, and explaining this interest in Black people on the part of most Northerners, was a growing conviction that an arrogant South was returning to Congress with increased political power, that its leaders were essentially the same men who had disrupted the Union and participated a costly and bloody war. That was no reason to suppose that these men had changed their convictions in the slightest, or surrendered for a moment their determination to dominate the country and fight monopoly and industry with monopoly in agriculture. In the face of their final failure, Southerners were demanding increased political power, and that political power could, in all probability, would be used for everything disadvantageous to the majority of the nation. It would be used against the spread of democratic ideals. It would be used for further increasing the political power of the South. It would be used against industry, property, and capital buttressed by the tariff and national banks and public debt. It was in vain that before, during, and since the war, the North had offered to compromise with its unyielding bloc. There was only one defense against the power of the South, and while that was revolutionary and hitherto undreamed of, it was the only way, and it could not be stopped by a stubbornness of one narrow-minded man. That was Black suffrage. Senator Sherman of Ohio said March 11, 1867, quote, "A year ago I was not in favor to extending enforced Black suffrage upon the Southern states, but the rejection of the 14th Amendment led him to give his support." There was evidently a understanding among the Republican senators and representatives that if the legislators of the Southern states organized under Johnson's scheme of Reconstruction accepted the 14th Amendment, and thus would say that either they would allow Black people to vote, or in the case they did not allow him, would forego representation based on his numbers. Then these states would be reorganized and admitted to Congress. That was more than fair to the South. Charles Sumner, to be sure, would not consent to it, and Stevens did not like it. But the industrial North was willing to throw Black people over on these terms. However, with the exception of Tennessee, the Southern states rejected the 14th Amendment almost unanimously, and insisted upon the Black Code unanimously. Upon the Black Codes, and accompanied their demands by widespread violence. Meantime, in minor measures, the sentiment of Black suffrage was seen to be crystallizing. Colorado had sought admission in 1866 and had less than 100 Black people. Sumner opposed the application because of the small population, and chiefly because the suffrage was confined to white males. He spoke March 12th and 13th, April 17th, 19th, and 24th on the subject. The bill passed the Senate despite Sumner. In the House, the attempt to strike it strike out the word, quote, white as a qualification for voters was defeated. The president vetoed the bill on account of insufficient population. Next session, Sumner amendment prevailed, but the president again vetoed the bill. Sumner made at the close of the session an unsuccessful attempt to make the same conditions in the bill to admit Nebraska, but failed. The president did not sign that bill. At the next session, the bill with black suffrage was passed over the president's veto. Sumner opposed the admission to Tennessee because black people were denied the right to vote. He failed to influence public sentiment, but made his opponent apologetic. Sumner wrote to F.W. Byrd, January 10th, 1867. I think you will be satisfied with the results on Nebraska and Colorado. The declaration that there shall be no exclusion from the elective franchise on the account of color is not in the form which I prefer. But you have the declaration, which to my mind is a great gain, is it not? And thus ends a long contest there where at first I was alone. Mr. Stewart of Nevada, who is sitting near me, says that it cannot be said now that the Republican Party is not committed to black suffrage. You have, quote, you have 1, the district bill, 2, the Nebraska bill, 3, the Colorado bill, 4, the territorial bill passed today, declaring that the territories there shall be no exclusion from the suffrage on account of color. In February 1867, from the Committee of 15, Stephen presented the leading construction measures. This measure declared that life and property were not safe in the former Confederate states, and that good order had to be enforced until loyal governments could be legally established. It divided the Confederate states into 5 military divisions: 1, Virginia; 2, North and South Carolina; 3, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida; 4, Mississippi and Arkansas; 5, Louisiana and Texas. A general with sufficient forces was to be assigned to each of these districts. These generals might use the United States civil courts to enforce the laws, but if these were to not effect, they might govern through military commissions. The sentences of commissions must be approved by the commanding officers. United States courts should issue no rights of habeas corpus against the acts of these commissions. This bill established martial law after the president had declared the war was ended. It puts the appointing of the district military masters in the hands of the general of the army instead of the president, and suspended the right of habeas corpus. Congress hesitated at these thoroughgoing terms. Blaine suggested that an amendment which would provide a way to escape from martial rule by promising admission when the state adopted the 14th Amendment and provided for black suffrage. Stephen refused to accept this, and the bill was passed February 13th. The Senate began to consider a bill February 5th and stayed in session until 3 o'clock in the morning. Resort was had to a party caucus. The Republican senators met meeting at 11 a.m. February 16th, Sherman, Sumner, Fessenden, and 4 others were put on the subcommittee to revise the House bill and remained in session a great part of the afternoon. The bill was changed so as to restore the appointment of heads of military districts and adopt the Blaine Amendment. The House had already passed Elliott's bill, admitting Louisiana with black suffrage, and Sumner wished that taken as a model. Sumner asked for black suffrage, but only one of the committee supported him. At 5 p.m., the caucus met, and Sumner renewed his proposition, excluding discrimination as to race and color for the basis of suffrage. It was carried in the caucus 15 to 13 or 14. This action committed the Republicans to the requirements of suffrage, respective of race or color, in the elections of delegates to the Reconstruction Convention, and as the basis of suffrage for the constitutions of the rebel states. Senator Wilson of Massachusetts said that, quote, then and there, in that small room, in that caucus, was decided the greatest pending question of the North American continent, end quote. It was accepted by the caucus through Feinstein was greatly displeased. He left the caucus and sought to defeat it by personal appeals. This led to the acrimonious debate in Congress, February 19th, but the bill passed after a night session at 6:22 Sunday morning, February 17th. The Congress had a difficult time passing this Reconstruction bill. The House rejected the Senate bill and time was flying. Finally, agreement was reached February 20th, and Congress expired by limitations on March 4th. The essential parts of the bill of black suffrage remained. The president, by taking the full time allowed by law to returning his veto, would leave only 2 days for Congress to pass the bill over his veto. Johnson and Seward immediately saw this, and the veto was held up to the last moment, reaching the House on the afternoon of March 2nd. The president said that the bill placed the people of 10 states under the complete domination of military rulers. Thus, these states had made provisions for the preservation of order, yet it was proposed to put them under military law. Quote, black people have not asked for the privilege of voting, and the vast majority of them have no idea what it means, end quote. We carried on a 4-year war to punish the crime, quote crime of defying the Constitution. If we now ourselves defy the Constitution, we prove that they are in fact fighting for black liberty. Stevens demanded immediate consideration of the veto, but allowed short statements from Democratic members who declared this bill a death knell and of Republican liberty. Hey, Shadow. On one opponent declared that the bill should not pass unless he was overpowered from physical exhaustion or restrained by the rules of the House. Stevens, in closing the debate, said that he had listened to the gentleman because he appreciated, quote, the melancholy feelings with which they are approaching this funeral of the nation. But as he desired the passage of the bill, he asked Mr. Blaine to move a suspension of the rules. Mr. Blaine accordingly made the motion, and after the ineffectual attempt at filibustering, the bill was passed over the veto by a vote of 135 yeas to 49 nays. The Senate speedily took similar action, and the Reconstruction bill became a law. And as finally passed, the bill set up the 5 districts, declaring that no adequate protection for life and property existed there. The president, instead of the general of the army, was to assign an army officer to each of these districts. These commanders might rule by martial law, but sentence of death had to be approved by the president. To escape from this regime, there must be universal suffrage without regard to race or color, and the frame of the state constitution with a convention composed of delegates not disqualified by participation in rebellion. The Constitution so adopted must provide the universal suffrage, and this Constitution must be ratified by a majority of the voters. The Constitution must also be approved by Congress. The state could not be amended until the 14th Amendment had been approved by 3/4 of the states of the United States. Thus Congress avoided making the admission of the states conditional upon their individual acceptance of the 14th Amendment. Hello. Still, Andrew Johnson was not beaten. As commander-in-chief of the army, he could execute the Reconstruction legislation, and he would throw its interpretation into the courts with a good chance of favorable decisions, just as the faltering attempt of Congress to give black people land was at last utterly nullified by Johnson's edicts of restoration. So there was equal chance to frustrate Congress in restoring state functions. Hey, Congress tried to tie Johnson's hand with a tenure of office bills. It was introduced in December 1866. The Constitution gave the president no express power to dismiss persons from office, but custom of logic had allowed it. The Republicans feared that by dismissal from office, Johnson would gain control of an entire executive division of the government at a time of crisis. The bill proposed that all officers appointed with the consent of the Senate would be removed only with the consent of the Senate, except in the case of cabinet officers. The House insisted on including cabinet officers, and finally the bill was passed, providing that the cabinet officers should hold their offices during the term of the president, by whom they were appointed, and 1 month thereafter. During that time, they could be removed only with the consent of the Senate. This measure went to the president on the 20th of February, together with the Reconstruction bill, and was voted March 2nd. The veto argued that status. I think I said veto. The veto argued from statuses, and informed practice that Congress had no power to force the president to retain in office again. His judgment subordinates whom he had appointed. Johnson said with curious logic, quote, whenever administration fails or seems to fail in securing any of the great ends for which Republican government is established, the proper course seems to be to renew the original spirit and in forms of the Constitution itself. End quote. Who was to be the judge of the original spirit, quote unquote? Andrew Johnson or the Congress? Which was to yield? Congress must yield to one stubborn, narrow-minded man, or it was forced by the necessity of controlling the executive to adopt this revolutionary measure? Sumner said in December 1866, it is possible that the president may be impeached. If we go forward and supersede the sham governments set up in the rebel states, we encounter the appointing power of the president, who would put in office men who sympathize with him. It is this consideration which makes adherent representatives say that he must be removed. Should this be attempted, a new question will be presented. Through fear of Johnson's action of the 40th Congress assembled in special session immediately after adjournment of the 39th, so that Congress was practically in continuous session, and there was no interregnum. I don't know that word. We're gonna find out what that word is. Look at that. Interregnum. A temporary period between two successive reigns, governments, or regimes, when normal authority is suspended, during which Johnson could exercise his uncurbed power. The new Congress immediately passed a supplementary Reconstruction bill to implement the main measure. This bill laid down a plan of registration for all male citizens 21 years of age and over, who could take the oath of loyalty, and made it the duty of the commanding generals to order elections and choose delegates for constitutional conventions. If the voters favored such constitutions were to be formed, and if adopted, transmitted to Congress. The whole machinery of elections was placed in the hands of the commanding generals. The veto of this supplemental bill came immediately. The president in effect declared that the rise of the masses of black labor to political power was, quote, an un an untired experiment which threatened, yeah, which threatened, quote unquote, the whites with even worse wrongs, quote unquote, than disenfranchisement for attempted rebellion, and made, quote, their conditions the most deplorable to which any people can be reduced, end quote. And this from the lifelong man of the people and champion of the rights of the poor. It was bad enough. What? Yes, I heard that. I did. Thank you. It was bad enough when Johnson confined himself to speeches as at Antietam, but when he came to action, Congress was further aroused. First, June 20th, he issued liberal instructions concerning the loyal oath and the duty of commanding generals. He decided on advice of his Attorney General Stanberry that those taking the oath of loyalty were judges of their own honesty and could not be questioned by the Board of Registration, that actual disenfranchisement for rebellion could only be made valid by law or court decisions. Disloyal sentiments along did not involve disenfranchisement. Moreover, in appointing generals, Johnson evidently proposed to appoint, as far as possible, generals who were sympathetic with the South. In July, he removed Sheridan from Louisiana and Texas and appointed First General Thomas, a Virginian Democrat, in his place, and finally General Hancock, a loyal follower of Johnson. The removal of Sheridan caused great excitement. The Loyal Legion held a great meeting asking for the immediate summoning of Congress and the dispossession of the president. He replaced General Sickles in the Carolinas with General Canby. Sheridan and Sickles were given posts in the North. These instructions were published in June 20th, and Congress replied by the Act of July 19th, 1867. This act specifically included Virginia, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Arkansas in the states to be reconstructed. It provided that all the so-called governments of the South should be subject to the orders of the district commanders and in the general of the army, and not the president. The bill made made the boards of registration judges of fact in regard to persons seeking to take the oath of loyalty, and it extended the time limit for registration of voters. The bill passed the House July 13th and was vetoed July 19th. Johnson protested against the attempt of the federal government to carry on state governments, and especially against the invasion of the constitutional powers of the president. His words were bitter. Whilst I hold the chief executive authority of the United States, whilst the obligation rests upon me to see that all the laws are faithfully executed, I can never willingly surrender that trust or the powers given for the execution. I can never give my assent to be made responsible for the faithful execution of laws, and at the same time surrendered that trust and the power which accompany it to any other executive officers, high or low, or to any number of executive officers. The bill was passed over the veto by both houses by overwhelming majority, and talk of impeachment started anew. The discussions, which was raged around the Reconstruction legislation, is of the same metaphysical stripe, characterizing all fetid worship of the Constitution. If one means by constitutional something provided for in that instrument, or foreseen by its authors, or reasonably implicit in its words, then the Reconstruction Acts were undoubtedly unconstitutional, and so on. For that matter, was the Civil War, in fact, the main measures of government during 1861 to 1870 were, quote, unconstitutional. The only action possible contemplated by the authors of the Constitution was succession. That action the constitutional fathers feared, the deprecated, but their instrument did not forbid it, and distinctly implied the legality of the state withdrawing from the more perfect union. Certainly, no one could argue that the founders contemplated civil war to preserve the union, or that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Yet unconstitutionally, the South made it a pro-slavery document, and unconstitutionally, the North prevented the destruction of the Union on account of slavery. And after the war, revolutionary measures rebuilt what revolution was disrupted. The former, and formed a new United States on the basis of broader than the old Constitution and different from its original conception. Why not? No more unintelligent programs could be laid down then to acquire a people to follow a written rule of government 90 years old. If that rule had been definitely broken in order to preserve the unity of the government and to destroy the economic anarchism in such a crisis, legalists may insist that consistency with precedent is more important than firm and far slighted rebuilding. But manifestly, it is not. Rule following, legal precedents, and political consistency are not more important than rights, justice, and plain common sense. Through the cobwebs of such political subtlety, Stevens crashed and said that military rule must continue in the South until order was restored, democracy established, and the political powers built on slavery smashed. Further than this, both he and Sumner knew that land and education for black people and white labor was necessary. On the first day of the second session of the 39th Congress, Sumner was on hand with his bill for establishing universal suffrage in the District of Columbia. He had accepted a place on the committee of the District of Columbia, in addition to his other duties to secure black suffrage. The committee reported a bill in December 1866, reading and writing as a qualification was moved as an amendment, but was rejected by the vote of 15 to 19. Sumner voted no. The bill did not reach a final vote, but came up again December 10th, 1867. When it passed after 4 days, debate by a vote of 32 to 13. The next day it passed the House and went to the President. Johnson and Seward, in the veto, kept hammering at the old thesis: Northern states will not allow black suffrage to be forced upon them against their will. The black population of the districts has recently been greatly increased by migration. Their rights can be protected in the district without the right of suffrage, just as much as in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, which refuses black people the right to vote. Because of slavery, the black people is not as well fitted to vote as the intelligent foreigner. Oh my God. And yet 5 years residence and knowledge of our government are required of the latter. The bill was repassed over the president's veto January 7th, and after it came the first proposal to impeach the president. A great step along the path of universal suffrage without color distinctions has just been taken in the House of Representatives. In its session of the 18th, the bill giving the right to vote to Black people in the District of Columbia passed with a majority of 114 to 54. An anxious crowd of whites and Black people mixed filled the galleries of the House and all the approaches of to the Capitol. The passage of the bill was hailed with a great outburst and frenzy applause. 3 days after the 40th Congress opened, Sumner offered a series of resolutions to provide homes and schools for freemen. This supplemented the Freedmen's Bureau law and provided a permanent policy of national aid to education and economic redress of the robbery of slavery. The resolution did not come to a vote. Sumner then tried to amend the Reconstruction Act of March 22nd and July 18th by provisions of free schools in the South without discrimination as to race. A tie vote defeated this effort, although the majority of the Republicans stood by him. He tried again and failed July 11th and July 13th. Quote, his disappointment at his failure in 1867 to secure schools and homes for the freedmen was too keen that he left the Senate chamber, and when he reached his house, his grief found vent in tears. Charles Sumner, frustrated with these demands, continued to direct the line of attack which he had initiated during the Civil War. He had in mind relief for free Black people in the North, as well as freemen in the South, and he was determined that petty race prejudice in the North should not escape attention because of the fight against slavery and its aftermath in the South. Early in the spring of 1867, March 11th, Stevens introduced a set of resolutions for the reinforcement of the Confiscation Act of July 7th, 1862, with a preamble as follows. Here it is. Whereas it is due to justice, as an example to future times, that some proper pain should be inflicted on the people who constituted the Confederate States of America, quote unquote, both because they declare an unjust war against the United States for the purpose of destroying Republican liberty and permanently establishing slavery, as well as for the cruel and barbarous manner in which they conduct said war, in violation of all rules of civilized warfare, and also to compel them to make compensation for the damage and expense caused by said war. Therefore, be it enacted that all public lands belonging to the 10 states that form the so-called, quote, Confederate States of America shall be forfeited by said states and become vested forthwith in the United States. The measure further provided as follows. And I'll read this measure and I'm going to see where I'm at. Section 2. The president should proceed at once to condemn the property forfeited under the aforesaid act on July 17th, 1862. Section 3. That a commission of appraisers be appointed to appraise said property. Section 4. That the land so seized and condemned should be distributed among the slaves who had been made free by the war and constitutional amendments and who were residing on said land. And on the 4th of March, 1861, or since, to each head of a family, 40 acres. To each adult male, whether head of the family or not, 40 acres. To each widow, head of family, 40 acres to be held by them in free sample, but to be unalienable for 10 years after they should become so seized thereof. Section 5 provides for the raising of the sum of $50 for each homesteader to be used for the erection of the building of his homestead, and that the further sum of $500 million be raised for the purpose of pensioning the veterans of the Union Army. So real quick, we're on page 383. I'm going to put a bookmark here. 383. I'm going to look ahead. And look ahead. Long, long, long. So long. Wow. Not a lot of stopping points on this book. The beginning of the book, there was. Jesus. All right. Okay. So the bill contains several other. Okay. Okay. It's a good. That's a good job. We're getting close to time, anyways. Come on. So stopping there, I added a bookmark. We went from Jesus 357 to 383. It's pretty good. All right. Looks like Sumner's trying to do his best he can to get all this done, but God, the vetoes and the bullshit, it's just, oh, the North and the South just don't, they just suck. They're just all racist. You know, Jesus Christ, can't even get anything done for black people. You know what I mean? Just destroy the United States at this point, right there, you know? Fucking hell. God, I wonder who the next president, I wonder where we're going to go next. So I'm interested. Um, yep. Anybody else have anything they would like to say? Yeah. Um, all right then. We'll continue on this bill of trying to get black suffrage and people like Sumner wants to give black people what they're due. He recognizes that. That's what I'm getting. I feel like Sumner is a good person for right now, you know. So trying to get black suffrages and stuff like that. But the whole point is this is a historical account of how the United States engaged after the Civil War and what they engaged with and who engaged with what. It's good material to learn history, to learn historical materialism through this, to understand the boundaries and like the roots of why we are the way we are now. You know what I mean? So it's good to read this. So, all right. So does anybody have anything to say before I close it down? All right. No worries. All right then. I'll go ahead and close it out. I hope everybody has a good day.